Okay, Jerry.
All right. Shalom, everyone. My name is Jerry Kaufman, and I'm a member of the Adult Education Committee of the Jewish Center in Princeton, New Jersey. On behalf of the committee, I welcome you to the third presentation in the Adult Education Goes Global series. The series was created to take advantage of virtual
I'm listening
learning
to
experiences. Somebody needs to mute.
I muted.
The series was created to take advantage of virtual learning experiences, which can originate live from anywhere in the world. This semester's presenters are from Hungary, England, Israel, the Netherlands, and the United States. Before I welcome Professor Sasha Goldstein-Sabbah, I would like to go over the ground rules for tonight. If you have questions for Professor Saba, please use the chat function to submit them for consideration. Please try to keep them as concise as possible. Audience members will remain muted throughout the presentation. This is being done to avoid inadvertent distractions. Sasha Goldstein-Sabbah is Assistant Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. She received her PhD in 2019 from Leiden University and specialized in the modern history of Middle Eastern and North African Jewry. She is the author of numerous scholarly and trade publications, including her recent monograph, Baghdadi Jewish Networks in the Age of Nationalism. That was published in 2021. This evening, Professor Goldstein-Sabbah will take us on a sweeping tour of the modern history of Jews from the Arab world. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Goldstein-Sabbah to the Jewish Center. Okay, Sasha, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Jerry. And thank you so much to the Jewish Center for having me today. I'm really delighted to be here virtually. This is a really big topic, but I'm going to try to give you a sweeping overview of kind of the history and the changes of the Jews from Arab lands over, well, more than a millennia, actually. Although, with the exception of the first part, I'll really focus on the modern and contemporary history. And then I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. And I hope it also inspires everybody to read more and discover more about the history and culture of Jews from the Arab world specifically, but maybe even the Islamic world as a broader idea. So just to give you a bit of an idea, and I'll come back to these numbers again, 70 years ago, almost every Arabic-speaking country had an important historic Jewish community. And what I mean by historic is that these were communities that had lived in one iteration or another in the country since the arrival of Islam, right? So these weren't seen as immigrant communities. These were seen as communities which were part of the fabric of this society. And the Jews themselves saw themselves as being part of the fabric of this society. And of course, today, with the exception of Morocco, and to a much lesser extent, Tunisia, you don't have these communities anymore. And I will explain as well some of the reasons why these communities have disappeared or migrated to other places. But I think it's nice to start with a poem. Who doesn't love poetry? And this is a poem written by Anwar Shaul. It's translated from Arabic by the fantastic scholar Orit Bashkin. And Anwar Shaul is considered one of the great Arabic language writers, actually, of the 20th century. And he's very much considered an Iraqi intellectual who happened to be Jewish. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a bit. But he writes, though I take my faith from the religion of Moses, I live under the protection of Muhammad's religion. I take refuge in the tolerance of Islam, and my inspiration is the sublime language of the Quran. I love of the nation of Muhammad, although I worship Moses. I shall remain as loyal as Al-Samal, whether miserable or blissful in my beloved city of Baghdad. And Al-Samal was a 6th century Jewish poet from the Arabian Peninsula. So as you can see in this, Anwar Shaul is really tying himself to Islamic history. But he was also very much a member of his Jewish community. He was president of the Jewish community. He was active in different communal institutions. And he was also active in Iraqi society. And so I hope my talk will allow you to understand how in the first half of the 20th century, you genuinely had Jews who lived in the Arab world and who saw themselves as being both Arab and Jewish, and that this wasn't in conflict in any way, shape, or form. And I want to add another layer, which maybe I'll be able to talk about or not, is Anwar Shaul's family. He came from a long line of Baghdadi Jews, but he did have one Ashkenazi great-grandfather who left Vienna in the mid-19th century and moved to Iraq. So it also shows that even some Jews who came from Europe, who found themselves in the Arabic-speaking world in the 19th century, their children and grandchildren certainly saw themselves as being Arab after a generation or two. And I think that challenges sometimes some of the ideas we have about Jewish-Muslim exchange and also Jewish communities in the Arab world in particular. So kind of part and parcel to that, I want to push you to think about the Jewish contribution to Islamic society, and at times a symbiosis, which we'll talk about, and at times, of course, more tension. And I want to introduce one kind of academic term. You guys get some terms in Arabic as well in a little bit, but one academic term, and that's the term Islamicate. And it was invented by a guy named Marshall Hodgson in the last century. And what's great is it kind of takes the Islam out of the societal idea. And so it's kind of at once precise and woolly. So we know we're talking about something related to Islam, and it evokes its past, present, and future, yet marks its influence as exceeding any creedal, so like religion, or cultural limits. It reflects a Muslim presence as both aesthetic and taste and ethical project. And what this really means is if we talk about an Islamicate society, it's a society which is heavily influenced by Islam, of course, but it's also influenced by the non-Muslims in that society. And so we can think about Jews in Islamicate society and how Jews are part of this society. I was asked to speak for a very long period of time compared to what I'm used to for online lecturing. So I thought I would break it up into 4 relatively bite-sized pieces. And then at the end of each section, if people have questions or comments related to that section, they're welcome to write them in the comment area. And then of course, at the end, I'm happy to answer any other further questions people may have. So I want to start at the beginning because probably you've heard before that Islam is influenced by Judaism, or Islam and Judaism developed together, but people don't really know what that means beyond, oh, well, Jews and Muslims both don't eat pork, right? So I think this is really important to contextualize. And of course, Islam develops in the 17th century in Arabia. And if you think about 7th century Arabia, before the time of Muhammad, as my professors told me back in the day when I was an undergraduate, it was really a Wild West. You had different tribes, you had Jewish tribes, you had Christian tribes, and you had polytheistic pagan tribes. And if we look at Muhammad, the revolution of Islam is not just kind of a spiritual revolution of a new faith, but it's also a political revolution because it brings order to the Arabian Peninsula, and then it will expand. And so Muhammad, as he's forming his religious theology, right, and Muslims, would say divine inspiration, we know that he's influenced by both Judaism and Christianity. And so a simple example of this is that in the beginning, Muslims pray 3 times a day, and it's only later to kind of distance themselves from Judaism that they start praying 5 times a day. And if you look at the beginnings of Islam, and lots of super interesting scholars have written about this, in the beginning, Muhammad is much closer to the Jewish tribes with whom he comes in contact because he genuinely thinks that they will convert to this new religion he is founding and align with him. And when this doesn't work, the Jewish tribes who he's in contact with in Medina are ultimately either banished or murdered, right? So we see here kind of 2 things. One, influence from Judaism, but also this very, violent rejection of these Jewish tribes. And this is the beginning. But instead of looking at this as a theological issue, it's really an issue of political consolidation. And why do we know this? Well, the relationship between Jews and Muslims as Islam expands is very different than these initial violent interactions. And so here's a map kind of the Islamic expansion in the 7th and 8th century. And as you can see, I think that the Muslim rulers, the first caliphs, they were even surprised by their success about how quickly they grew. And, this is back in the day. There are no cell phones, there's no internet. Running an empire is very complicated. And there is a question of, well, what do you do with the peoples you conquer? And in the areas that Islam expands to, in most areas, you either have Muslim or Jewish groups. More Jews in this period, and this is still a period where most Jewish communities are located around the Mediterranean basin and then going towards what's today Afghanistan, right? Because the Second Temple is destroyed in 70 CE. And up until around the 14th, 15th century, we know that the majority of Jewish communities are located around the Mediterranean basin and what is today considered the Islamic world. So they come into contact with these groups, and theologically, they don't pose, as Islam is expanding, these Jewish tribes or communities in places along the North African coast, in what is today Syria and Lebanon and Iraq. They don't forcibly convert them. They co-opt them to be a part of their empire. And what evolves over time is something called the Pact of Umar. And we don't really know where it comes from. The tradition would say it's a letter between a Christian community and the Muslim rulers, but it applies to all monotheistic religions in the Islamic world at this time. And the deal is this, right? Kind of the long and the short of it. People of the book, so monotheists, and that's Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, which you'll find in Iran today. They're not allowed to build any new houses of worship. They're not allowed to study Quran. There's a prohibition to show religion in public. They have to show an obligation. There's an obligation to show deference to Muslims. So Muslims are above Jews in this case in the social structure. They need to have an appearance which is distinguishable from Muslims. Proselytizing is prohibited. There's a limitation on names because names can carry very important significance within this emergent Islamic society. And there's a prohibition from selling alcohol to Muslims, right? So it's pretty strict. In return from following these laws, non-Muslims will receive protection in Dar al-Islam, in the Islamic Empire, in this society, right? That's how it sets up. That's the document. And from this, a legal structure will emerge. And maybe you've heard some of these terms, maybe you haven't, but you'll have the idea of Ahl al-Kitab, so people of the book, right? That's why we talk about Christians and Jews, monotheists. And Muslims certainly see, Jewish prophets as prophets in their tradition, and it's that Muhammad supersedes this, similarly to the way that Christians see Jesus as superseding Judaism, right? And this status, based on the Pact of Umar, is called the dhimma, right? It's this protected status. It's also sometimes given this very negative connotations. We'll discuss that a little bit more. And in exchange for this protection as well, Jews are expected to pay special taxes, the haraj and the jizya. And these taxes are paid by the community, right? So it's calculated on how large the community is, but it's paid collectively, which will also be important for communal cohesion. And just another kind of vocabulary, think about is the term, if you've heard it before, Mela, Mahala, or Harat al-Yahud. And these are traditional areas where Jews live. Now, sometimes these get translated as ghetto. I'd be very careful about this. With the exception of Morocco and Yemen, Jews aren't required to live in a specific neighborhood. It's a choice, and it's a choice that makes sense, right? Because you want to be near a synagogue, you want to be near your community. But this is really how Jewish society will develop. And remember, if we're talking about from the time of Muhammad, Judaism is still developing itself. The Talmud is still being written. And so we can see most clearly in the way Jewish law is structured and Islamic law is structured that these two traditions will influence each other. So with this deal, right, because it's really a social contract in many ways, Jewish communities under Islam have a lot of autonomy, right? Within their synagogues, the theology is not contested. The liturgy continues and develops. Religious processions and building is officially prohibited, but we'll discuss that a little bit more in a second. Traditional dress is respected, right? Kippot, head coverings for men. There are limitations in certain places on wearing certain types of dress because they're associated with Islam. And you have a Jewish communal infrastructure that develops, right? On the one hand, you have rabbis who provide religious leadership, not so different to the way imams and Islamic legal scholars will also provide religious leadership, and a lay leadership, which is responsible for the collection of taxes, and which will also liaise with the Islamic rulers in the area. And this communal organization will also deal with inheritance, for example. Now, what's important or kind of interesting about this is Jews will have legal jurisdiction over their communities, right? So if there are issues if there are issues between two Jews in a community, it is settled in a Jewish court. So obviously, marriage, divorce, inheritance, that is all handled by the rabbinate, but also legal issues. If somebody takes you to court, it is done within a Jewish context. And this also pushes these Jewish communities to form within themselves in parallel to Islam. Now, this all seems, very stringent and very tough for Jews. And, the 7th century, no buildings of synagogues, no Jews studying with Muslims. What happens? Well, reality is very different from law. And I think these different images really show that. So now that I can use the laser pointer, right? A couple of examples. This image right here is of a Jew and a Muslim playing chess together in Al-Andalus, so Islamic Spain. So obviously there were friendships and there were exchanges, and enough so that you would have art reflecting it. This here in the lower right corner is the Beit al-Hikmah in Baghdad, which is the House of Wisdom. And this was, we'll translate it as kind of a philosophical salon. And we know that Jews and Muslims and Christians and Zoroastrians all learned together and discussed philosophy, right? So we know that there were these intellectual exchanges. And when we speak about no synagogues being built, well, this is a synagogue in Morocco, which is obviously built after the arrival of Islam in Morocco. And this is the very famous Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo, right, where Maimonides was the rabbi. And this was also built under Islam. And then, of course, Maimonides, who is the doctor to the Sultan in Egypt and is also a communal leader, and who also exchanges with Islamic scholars and whose work on philosophy is read by Muslims. And finally, you have this man, Sassoon Heskel, who will be a senator in the Ottoman Parliament, and who will become Iraq's first Minister of Finance. So although there is a rigid, we can say, legal structure, in reality, there's much more exchange and there's much more room for Jewish life to flourish. And what we see over, let's say, the first 1300 years of Jewish-Muslim interaction in this Islamicate society is that you have cultures which develop together, right? The music of Jews from the Islamic world is the same structure of music as Muslims. Dress styles are similar. There are differences, right? Just as you have status differences, it's very confessional. Christians have kind of one way of dressing, Muslims have one way of dressing, Jews, but there are similarities. Literature styles are shared. So that poem that I read to you in the beginning, which is a bit older, it's originally in Arabic and it uses the same kind of styles of poetry that were popular at that time. Art, if we look in the synagogues, I showed you, was it the last slide or two slides? Yeah, in the last slide, you can see obviously heavily influenced by the wider architecture. Food, we eat the same food. So to give you an example, there's a Moroccan soup called harira. There's a very good article on New York Times Cooking, if anyone wants to try it out. And Muslims in Morocco traditionally make this soup to break their fast during Ramadan, while Jews make this same soup to break the fast of Yom Kippur, right? So in Morocco, the Muslim majority eats couscous for Friday lunch, and traditionally Jews eat couscous for Friday night dinner. And finally, Jews speak Arabic, right? And in some places, you have a Jewish dialect, which is distinguishable. Morocco and Iraq are examples of this. In other places, you have local dialects that are spoken by everybody and they're not distinguishable. One other thing that sometimes people ask me is the question of, well, what is Judeo-Arabic? Now, Judeo-Arabic is not a spoken language, it's a written language. And Judeo-Arabic is simply writing the Arabic language in Hebrew script with additional loanwords that come from Hebrew. So it's more influenced by Hebrew, but it's just writing Arabic. So Jews traditionally, in most cases, up until the 20th century, will write in Judeo-Arabic because they learned to write in Hebrew script, not in Arabic script. But that doesn't mean what they're speaking isn't Arabic. And it doesn't mean that they won't influence the Arabic language. So kind of some basic conclusions from part one. The Islamic framework that develops is firm and has limitations, but ultimately it allows Jewish society to flourish. There are moments, of course, of political instability, but overall, Jewish society develops within Islam, right? And it's really only in the 14th century that we see a population swap and you have a larger Jewish population in Europe than in the Islamic world. People often ask me, well, how is Jewish life really in the Islamic world? Well, you can't give binary statements of it was good or it was bad. But if we compare Jewish life under medieval Islam compared to medieval Christianity, Jews fared much better under medieval Islam than under medieval Christianity. And this is also because Christianity develops very much in contrast to Judaism, right? With Jews as the as the murderers of Jesus. Islam just sees themselves as being an evolution, but says ultimately it's a monotheist tradition, people of the book, and they're kind of benevolently ignored from a theological perspective in most cases. An important kind of, as we move on, is that this framework, and why I start with it, even though I was asked to speak more about the modern period, it really remains unchanged until the beginning of the 19th century, right? So that's what I'm going to talk about moving forward, is what happens when this changes. So I see there's something in the chat. Intermarriage. That's a good question. So maybe I'll answer that now. Jews, now I have to figure out how to close the chat because of what I did. One sec. If I take that away, okay, now I can close it. So there are always cases of intermarriage. The reality is, if a Jew marries a Muslim in Islamic society, they will convert to Islam. That's the law. You have examples of it. You have some examples of Jews marrying Christians as well. It's indicative of the cultural exchanges. Afterwards, we don't really have any stories of Muslims converting to Judaism because that is not allowed. Very similar, in fact, to the few Christians who would convert to Judaism in the medieval or early modern Christian world. Are there any other questions? Okay.
Jerry sent me a question, just a second. Jerry Kaufman, I didn't see that. It hasn't come up. You want to ask that yourself?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to know if you could discuss, if it's not off track, the Berber people and how they interacted with Jewish culture.
Okay, so for those who don't know who Berbers are the indigenous peoples of Morocco, right? So the people who were there before Islam. And when the Berbers, when the Arabs arrive in Morocco, they ultimately convert the majority of Berber tribes to Islam. Now, there are some tribes who we believe, we're still not 100% sure on this, who were Jewish, right? Who were converted by Jews, who left the Holy Land after the destruction of the temple, settled in Morocco, and converted to, these Jews who went there converted Berber tribes to Judaism. The relations are, I mean, there's a lot of exchange. You have these communities who live together, and you can theoretically have Berber Jews. So some Jews are Berbers. And I think today, because there's this idea to preserve Berber culture, Jews and Berbers are kind of seen as the two minorities of Morocco. One is kind of a religious minority, and maybe one is more of an ethnic, linguistic minority. But there is quite a bit of exchange. So maybe we'll get back to that a little bit more as well. So if we're talking now, I remember I said you have this legal structure, you have these Jewish communities. Each city is its own independent Jewish community. You might have a rabbi or an individual who writes to a rabbi or an individual of another community for advice, but there is no pope in Judaism, as we always say. And so these communities are very much independent. And they have their own traditions, their own cultures, their own dialects. It doesn't mean that Jews don't move. Of course, they move and they travel, but each community has its traditions, and they're relatively independent of each other, functioning in their own society. Because in 1800, the society of Morocco is, of course, not the same as what will become modern day Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or Egypt. So where are we in 1800? Now that we've kind of sped up in our time travel, Islam remains this legal and social framework, and Jews still have this legal and religious autonomy. Morocco is what they call a Sharifan sultanate. So there's a sultan and it's independent. The rest of the region is part of the Ottoman Sultanate, right? The Ottoman Empire. From a religious perspective, the minority groups are Jews and Christians. North Africa, it's pretty much only Jews. In the Levant, you have important Christian communities as well. The borders are relatively closed. Islam by this period is not the same intellectual and philosophical powerhouse that it was in the time of Maimonides, for example, in the 11th and 12th century. It's become much more conservative, and it has concerns about the penetration of European ideas. And so within this Islamicate society, there's a comfort with Jewish and Christian elites who have their co-religionists in Europe, that they're acting as bridges. So Jews in the Islamic world know of their co-religionists in Europe. They even might have some exchanges, but it's relatively closed off, right? Up until 1800. And the dhimma, right? These legal rules are still observed across the region, mostly pretty mildly. The two places where Jewish life is the harshest would be Morocco and Yemen. But in other places, Jews have more or less the majority of rights as as well as Muslims in this case. What does the society, this Islamicate society, look like? Well, poverty and economic insecurity, public health, issues like blindness, child mortality, women dying in childbirth, lack of secular education, political instability. You have the Ottoman Empire, but of course, local officials get overthrown and it can be violent. Lack of public infrastructure. You don't have trains, for example. The post office is relatively privatized. There's little public infrastructure. Now, these are challenges to the Jewish community. They're challenges to the larger society of all religious communities. And frankly, they're challenges for most of the world in 1800. So not much, the status quo is kind of preserved. What's going to change, right? If anyone has kind of studied modernity, what's going to happen that's going to change these societies? And we're going to talk about the Jews of the Arab world in the modern period. And when I teach, spend a lot of time on this with my students. I'll give you guys a more abbreviated story, of course, but there are kind of three forces of change. One are internal reforms from the Ottoman Empire, called the Tanzanite Reforms, to Western influences, and I'm going to go into that a bit more, and then migration, right? So people moving from rural places, so Jews who see themselves as Berber Jews who live in mountains, for example, what Jerry said, but also Jews in places like Yemen, for example, who decide to move to cities where there's more opportunity. And then you'll also have, in Morocco, Jews moving to South America, Iraqi Jews moving to India. And that is also kind of part of these forces of change because they will come in contact with other societies and other cultures, and they will change the culture of their communities as well. So what are these Tanzimat reforms? Well, the Ottoman sultans in the 19th century abolished the dhimma. They abolished these rules, right? So this idea of ahl al-kitab goes away. This idea of Muslims are above Jews and Christians goes away. And this is part of larger, wide sweeping reforms. That's the only one part of it. There's also a huge push to build secular schools, to build infrastructure. So trains, tramways in cities, hospitals. It's a huge modernization project, which is very much influenced by Europe. I tell my students, I say it's European inspired, but not European required. But what does this do to the Jewish community, right? And the Jewish community in particular, this abolition of the millet, on the one hand, you can say, great, Jews are now citizens. but it kind of has some unexpected consequences, because what the Ottomans say is there's no idea of a secular society. We are a religious society. Instead, we're going to recognize official religious communities. We're going to call them millets, which is a term which has been floated around before this, but it really gets institutionalized in the 19th century. And the millet is it's an administrative arrangement, right? So you have your communal independence, but now the state is going to organize your communal independence. And they say, okay, the Christians, because it's actually based on some of the Eastern Christianities, they have a pope, right? Eastern Orthodox Jews, I'm not talking about Catholics. They have a pope. So Jews need a chief rabbi. So instead of these independent communities in the Ottoman Empire, they say you're going to have a chief rabbi in Istanbul, and then you're going to have a chief rabbi in each of the provinces, the wilayat, and then each city is going to have its chief rabbi. And so as part of kind of this modernization, the Tanzanite Reforms actually give more power to the rabbis and the religious leaders, and they take some power away from the secular leaders of these communities, and the state begins to dictate what the religious communities should be doing. So what are the implications of these Tanzanite reforms? Well, some Muslims protest. Surprise, surprise. It's an end to the officialization of their higher status, but many non-Muslims are also unhappy because it undermines the communal autonomy. The Ottomans are now saying this is how you need to structure your community. And the Jewish community of Iraq, for example, of Baghdad, they don't really have much in common with the chief rabbi in Istanbul. They follow different religious traditions, they have different communal histories. So it's a frustration that they're now tied to the chief rabbi. At the same time, this is carried out very unevenly, and it takes many decades for the Tanzimat reforms and the millet in particular to be standardized across the Ottoman Empire. And by the time it gets standardized, you have World War I, and guess what? The Ottoman Empire disappears. But it's one of the factors that begins to kind of upend the traditional structure of Jewish life in the Islamic world. So that's one factor that's going to change the life of Jews, okay? What's the second one? Well, European imperialism, right? And you can see this map. And for the purposes of our discussion today, the most important influences are obviously the French in North Africa and the Spanish in northern Morocco, and then the British in, well, Egypt, in Iraq, certainly in Palestine during the British Mandate, in Lebanon and Syria, where French is important. And what happens? What influence do they have on the Jewish communities, and how do they change this kind of relationship, this symbiosis or this balance between Jews and Muslims? Well, why do they want to go into these countries? Well, imperial expansion. There are economic ramifications, and at times they justify this by a moral imperative. We need to protect religious minorities, Christians often, Christian minorities, but also Jewish minorities. And on the back end, there's an economic benefit. And this begins at the end of the 18th century with Napoleon, and certainly continues through the 19th century and the 20th century. Now, when Europeans arrive in these places, how do they view Jews? They often view them as friendly locals, right? Because they see them as more open to European influence. They see them as communities which are willing to change quickly. You have links with European Jewish communities that I'm going to talk about in a moment. They're multilingual, right? They speak Arabic, they speak Hebrew. If they're traders, they might speak some European languages, and they've already been providing this historic cultural bridge. So as you have greater European influence, this actually leads to socioeconomic opportunities for the Jewish communities as they become more European, as they work for European nations, as they become part of colonial civil services. Coupled with this, you have something called Jewish internationalism. And I don't know if anyone's ever heard this term, but it's this idea that develops in the mid-19th century by Western European emancipated Jews. And in this case, they say to themselves, we're now emancipated, which means we now have rights as citizens and we can vote. But we could also lose these rights very quickly. And what's the best way to preserve these rights? Well, it's to ensure that Jews from around the world have the rights that we have. And in a moment, I'll tell you what kind of tips this off. But you can see kind of the French leader of this is Adolphe Crémieux. That's the image on top. And the person below is Moses Montefiore, who is the British kind of father of Jewish internationalism. The two men worked together. They also couldn't stand each other. So maybe that goes back to the traditional French-British rivalries. But you can also think about it in this age where Jews in Europe are developing national identities. In addition to this, there's some concern that Jews will be converted by Christian missionaries as you have colonialism in Europe. And that also motivates it. Just one other thing I should say, this interest in Jewish internationalism is not just about the Jews of the Islamic world. There's actually even more interest in Eastern European Jewry, but the Western European Jews can't get into Eastern Europe as easily as they can to the Islamic world. Why? Because the nations which they are part of are less invested from a colonial perspective in those places. So what tips off Jewish internationalism? There are two events. One event is the Damascus affair, if anyone's heard of it, which is when a Capuchin monk in Damascus disappears. And the local Jewish community is accused of this because they said they need their blood to make matzah, very traditional trope. And the predicament of the Syrian Jews who are put in jail arouses deep concern amongst European Jewry, right? And what's interesting about this affair is it's really the first event where European Jews are aware of what's going on in the Islamic world in real time. And they also see the risk, because these are Catholics who are accusing of this, that anti-Semitic factions within their own states, so in this case, France, could bring more anti-Semitism to the Islamic world, which traditionally has at times anti-Jewish tendencies, but not European-style medieval anti-Semitism. So that is kind of the awakening of we need to help our brethren in the Islamic world. But there's a second, even more telling event, which happens closer to home, and that's the Mortara case in Bologna in 1860, so not so long ago. But a Catholic nanny baptizes a Jewish child in secret and then tells the church 2 years later, and the church takes the child away from the family and puts him in a convent, and the family never regains their child. And when the emancipated Jews of Europe hear this, and they're unable to have the child be brought back to his family, they realize how fragile their own emancipation is. And this really is kind of the birth of transnational Jewish philanthropy. And so, of course, it's about Jews supporting each other, but it's also about emancipated Jews protecting their own rights. And of course, the two of those don't contradict each other. And so in the mid-19th century, or even late 19th century, you'll have a flourishing of Jewish solidarity networks. The Alliance Israélite Universelle, which is founded in Paris, and that's really the first of these organizations. They're the ones who will say, if we can go into other countries and educate the Jewish populations, we're talking about secular education, and we can make them model citizens in very much a French cultural idea of colonization, we can show the French that Jews are valued citizens, and we can also elevate these Jewish communities. The Anglo-Jewish Association will be founded slightly after that and do something similar. And then even later in the beginning of the 20th century, you'll have the American Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, and the Hilfsverein der Deutsche Juden in Germany that will also become involved in looking at how they can help the Jewish communities of the Arab world or the Islamic world navigate kind of between colonialism, regime change, and how can they elevate their communities. Obviously, very much from a perspective of Western intellectual superiority, of course, but certainly with the right ideas at heart, let's say, and meaning to do well. And what does that mean? Well, they partner with Jewish communities, right? They partner with these communities who have these societal challenges, and they build schools. They send teachers to teach English and French and math and science. They send doctors and nurses to help set up clinics. And they continue to lobby local and European governments to protect the rights of these Jews in the Islamic world. And this is done in collaboration with communal leaders. And communal leaders in these countries don't always agree with individual policies of these organizations. So one example of this, for example, is in Iraq. The Alliance has these schools and they have curricula. But the Iraqi Jewish community says, you just want to teach in French. We speak Arabic here. If we want to be part of the society, we need to teach Arabic, right? And frankly, if we're going to teach a foreign language, we need to teach English, not French. So there's a push and pull between this kind of cultural transformation that happens in these communities. But overall, between colonialism and internal reforms, Jewish communities are very open to changes. And I would say, for the most part, embrace modernity with open arms. Now, the rabbis at times are not happy with this, of course. And why are they not happy with this? Well, the Tanzimat gave them even more rights and more power. And when these Jewish organizations come in, they very much push a secularization of Jewish society in some ways, and they take away power from the rabbinate. And they also take away parnasa, right? The salaries, because education was under the jurisdiction of the religious leaders prior to the establishment of secular schools. So as these schools come in, the rabbis also find themselves having to reestablish their places within these societies. So there's a push and pull, and modernity in any society is complicated, but I particularly find it fascinating within the context of Jews in the Islamic world. So the community gets consolidated. They're not so happy about this. And due to this consolidation, you have Jews who study Turkish in the 19th century, which is kind of a new thing. But then also with the British and the French coming into the region, Jews begin to speak French and English slightly later. So you have a linguistic shift going away from Hebrew and local dialects of Arabic. You have socioeconomic improvement because Jews find themselves in this advantageous position where in many ways they're kind of the link between Europe and the local society more and more. And then within these local societies in the late 19th century, Jews have increased political and cultural capital. They're members of the Ottoman parliament. They work in the civil service. And by this period, you even have some Jews who begin to consider themselves Ottoman. At the same time, it's complicated. So on the positive side, shall we say, well, the rabbinate is undermined. We can debate whether that's a good thing or not. And people can ask more questions or put comments about that. But Jews begin to speak European languages. They begin to become part of emergent middle classes in the late 19th and early 20th century. Jews start adopting Western dress because they're now working in Western firms because they've attended secular schools. girls have access to education, and women have greater freedom outside of the home. And all of this will happen within kind of the wider Islamicate society, but it will happen first within the Jewish society. And this is in part due to this push from Western European Jewry and the desire of these communities to follow these trends in Westernization. So what are the consequences? Well, Jews become closer to Europeans, and they become really central to the civil services of many of these societies. So that's kind of positive, but at the same time, many people are unhappy by colonialism. And so now Jews in some ways begin to be seen as part of the other, part of the colonial authority. And as a consequence, there also is some distance setting in with their Muslim neighbors, whereas prior to this, they were all kind of on the same footing, shall we say. Unlike Western European or Central European Judaism in this time period, you don't have any religious fragmentation. You don't have any movement of Reform Judaism and then conservative Judaism in the Islamic world. Why? Because even up until the mid-20th century, you still have to be part of a religious community in these societies. And so you stay within your Jewish community. Does that mean that some people are less observant? Sure. But there's no margin within this structure to form a parallel religious community because it's part of the state infrastructure. And one story I love is in Egypt. Now we're talking about the early 20th century. The rabbi notices that women start wearing strapless dresses or off-the-shoulder dresses for weddings. And he really sees this as being immodest and inappropriate. But instead of saying to the women, you have to dress like this, or you need to change what you wear, he starts requiring that wedding services be in synagogues because he knows that no woman would dare to have bare shoulders in a synagogue. So you see the rabbis being forced to adapt in a different way, and they're not able to kind of reject modernity in the way that some Jews reject modernity outright within Europe. Now, as a caveat here, the Arab world is wide, and this measure of Westernization is different in different places at different times. And this Westernization comes much later to Morocco and Yemen than it does to a place like Lebanon or Baghdad or Cairo, for example. So a couple of conclusions. You have a linguistic transformation that starts in the 19th century, where the Jews of the Arab world who used to speak Arabic and Hebrew start speaking Turkish from a nationalist perspective, but if they're part of the Ottoman Empire, but also start really speaking European languages due to secular education. And of course, these students who are educated in Western style schools, we call them agents of modernity. And within a generation or two, you see kind of an abandonment of wearing traditional dress outside the home. It becomes acceptable for women to have jobs of teachers and nurses outside of the home, and this changes very, very quickly. There's always a bit of a tension between the secular and the religious leadership, but overall, between colonialism and internal reforms, the social order is completely upended. But by the end of the 19th century, or let's say on the eve of World War I, the Jews of the Arab world very much are closer to Europe culturally. And that, of course, creates a bit of a gulf with their Muslim neighbors. So we'll see if you can see where this is going. So that was part 2, which is kind of the big trends. And now I'm going to speak about kind of 4 examples of countries and what these societies look like to kind of zero in a little bit more. I see one question here, which is the impact in the 15th century of the expulsion from Spain, right? So 1492, we all know the Inquisition, Jews leave Spain. a small amount of Jews go to Western Europe, to Amsterdam, not so far from where I live, to London, but the majority settle within the Islamic world. And so this will have an influence. It's a very sophisticated Jewish society, the Sephardic Society of Muslim Spain. It will change the demographics of Moroccan Jewish society, because now you will have kind of the indigenous Jewish community who will mix with the the Andalusian Jews who will see themselves as being more cultivated. So you'll have kind of similar social dynamics that you would have towards Eastern and Western European Jews in New York City in the late 19th or early 20th century. But eventually those two groups will mix. And then you'll have a large influx of Jews who will wind up in what is today Turkey, so in the Ottoman world. And what's interesting about that, of course, is the linguistic perspective, that they'll speak Judeo-Spanish. And so they'll kind of maintain their communal identity, which is this Judeo-Spanish communal identity, and they'll differentiate themselves from the historic communities of those places. So 200-300 years later, in a place like Damascus, you'll have two Jewish communities. You'll have a Sephardic community, and you'll have a Mustarabi, which means like the Arabs, an Arabic-speaking community. So you'll have more Jews who return to the Islamic world in the 15th century due to the Inquisition, but they'll maintain their communal independence. And it's not until really the reforms of the 19th century where then they're forced to reorganize and see how they fit in with the Arabic-speaking communities. That being said, that's what we hear on paper. We also know that Jews marry between these communities, and there is cultural permeability. Any other questions?
Yeah, one other question from Louise Sandberg. She asks, where do the documents that you spoke of when you were talking about the 18th and 19th centuries in this section, where do the documents in the Cairo Geniza fit into your work and the structure in this history?
So I am not a Geniza specialist. The Cairo Geniza, for those of you who haven't heard of it, is, right, okay, so a Geniza. What do we do with holy Jewish works or works that have the name of God on them? We can bury them, or we can put them in a room. And when you put them in a room or a space, because you're no longer using them, it's called a Geniza. And this is very popular, especially in the Islamic world. The most famous discovery was in the late 19th century of the Cairo Geniza, which was a space that was used for almost 1,000 years, actually, where all documents that carried the name of God were stored if they were no longer in use. When it was discovered, it was the largest historical find ever for knowledge about the medieval Islamic world. And I'm not just talking about the Jewish medieval Islamic world, I'm just talking about the medieval Islamic world. So most of it is about Jews, but we now know that there's also information about Muslims. You have work in Hebrew, in Arabic, but also Chinese and at times Western languages. And one of the great centers for studying the Geniza is actually at Princeton, so close to where you guys are located. Another center for Geniza studies is at Cambridge, and then of course, other places have some fragments. So you had these fragments. The influence that they had on Jewish history is not quantifiable. I'm a modern historian. I look at the 19th and 20th century, so the Geniza findings don't influence my work so much. That being said, to give you an idea of what was found in the Geniza, you had dowry lists, for example. So you could have an idea about the social status or what people gave. You would have grocery lists as well, so you could know what people would eat. You have discussions about charity and piety, so you could get demographic information about this. So we actually know more about Jewish life in Cairo, let's say between the 11th and 14th centuries, than we know about many other places in the medieval world. And then, of course, Cairo was one of the great centers of the world in this period. So we have information from other places as well. You have letters of Jewish traders who were in India. So people from Cairo in the 12th century, 13th century, who would travel to India, who would write to their wives, or who would write to the guardian of their wives. So we have really an idea of the social organization of these times. And the story it tells is kind of what I started off with, this idea that Jews lived under Islam, they flourished, they were kind of social rules that were based on these ideas of theology, but Jewish life was relatively stable, and that's what allowed this cultural explosion, shall we say. So, I mean, the Geniza, scholars have been studying these documents for over a century now, and there's even a new generation. If you're interested in this, actually, two ideas. One, there's Goldstein was kind of like the big scholar of the Geniza. But if you Google or like in YouTube, you put the name Marina Rustow. She's a Geniza scholar. She's a little bit older than I am. She got a MacArthur grant a couple years ago, and she can kind of even explain the modern relevance of the Geniza and how it's still allowing us greater insight into the medieval world. So I hope that helps answer the question. So now, because I've been giving you kind of these big, wide themes about Jewish life and interaction, but I said each country has its own story and its own culture. So I picked 4, which have kind of different stories to really focus on the 19th and 20th century experiences, which I hope you find interesting. And if you really want to know about a different country that I don't mention, feel free to ask at the end. But Algeria. So Algeria has a very specific history. The French come in 1830, and remember, they see the Jews as these friendly natives, these people who can be this bridge, who aren't against French rule because, well, they're under Muslim rule, why not French rule? The French slowly decide to really make the Jews their intermediaries. And one of the things they do is they send Ashkenazi rabbis to Algeria as early as 1845 to reorganize the communal infrastructure. So kind of similarly what's going on with the Tanzanite Reforms. But the real game changer is in 1870. And in 1870, you have the Crémieux Decree. And that's when France says, the 30,000 Jews on the Algerian coast, you're French citizens now. And by giving them French citizenship, you're giving them the rights and responsibilities of being a French citizen. What does that mean? You can now go to public schools, French schools. You can now work in the civil service. You can now move to France if you want. And the Algerian Jews, in the span of a generation or two, see themselves as full French citizens, right? They become completely French. They stop in many places speaking Arabic. It depends on the cities, but you have stories where grandparents who were alive in 1870 and only spoke Arabic are unable to speak with their grandchildren who only speak French, because the children learned French in school, spoke French together, and then only spoke French to their children. Now, how does this play into Zionism, which I haven't spoken about yet? Well, there's little interest in Zionism in a place like Algeria. Why? Because in many ways, Zionism either comes from religious fervor in the context of the Messiah, or certainly in the case of Eastern Europe, kind of the birthplace of modern political Zionism, or Central Europe, right? A dissatisfaction with modernity. But in the case of Algeria, modernity is working out well for the Algerian Jews. They're more distanced from the Muslim population, who is not given universal citizenship, but they're not interested in Zionism. They're interested in flourishing within their local society and becoming part of the French nation. And we'll see how that plays out a little bit later as well. So that's kind of one model where in the span of 2 generations, you have a historic Jewish community, which has been in Algeria for centuries, begins to see itself as French, right? And they don't have an interest in Zionism because it doesn't speak to the needs of their community. We can contrast this with Morocco. Morocco has very little European intervention in the 19th century, and the treatment of Jews is relatively harsh. Slowly, again, 19th century, some Jews in the coastal towns get British and French passports, and they get these in service to acting as these intermediaries, and that gives them some protection. Similarly, the first school, the first Jewish secular school in this Alliance system is built in Tétouan. Tétouan is in northern Morocco in 1862. And you have Moses Montefiore in 1863, who goes to Morocco, who tries to improve the socio-political standing of the Jews. It's not very successful. In Morocco, the French, although they'll come in and they'll make Morocco a protectorate, they never give Jews universal citizenship. And so you don't see this quick kind of change where Moroccan Jews see themselves as being French. They're both heavily influenced by French society, which they see through colonialism as giving them additional access to employment, to education opportunities for their children. But they're much more dependent as well on these transnational Jewish organizations. And as such, I would argue, they remain a much more religious society than Algerian Jewry, which becomes more secular in nature. So because of that, they have a greater attachment to Zionism, actually, but it's also from a religious position, right? They see this as being part of the coming of Olam Haba, right? The world to come. And so it's interpreted in a different manner in this kind of experience of modernity. So they find themselves between their traditional society, between being active in these Jewish networks, and also becoming closer to friends. In complete contrast to all of this is Iraq. Again, all 4 of these communities, which I'm kind of spotlighting, are historic communities. They're never seen as being immigrant communities. They know the cultural codes. They're seen as being members of these societies. If you want to talk about one historic Jewish community, I would say Iraq wins the prize. I don't know if it's true, but at least they say they trace their origins to the Babylonian exile. And certainly you have Jewish life, continuous Jewish life in Iraq for at least 2,000 years, probably longer. Similar form in that you have the Alliance coming in 1864, they build a school, then they build a girls' school. The Jewish community flourishes from a socioeconomic perspective. They function very much as kind of this intermediary between the British in Iraq and the local government. They form an important Baghdadi trade diaspora. That's actually what my book is about, in Southeast Asia. And they flourish in this period in the late 19th and early 20th century. But there's something that differentiates them from the North African communities. And that is tied to the 1924 Constitution, which makes Iraqi Jews citizens of Iraq. And this act of making them citizens makes them part of the local society on paper in a way that never really happens in a place like Morocco or Algeria. And one of the ways you see this is the value of Arabic. So Jews in Iraq stop writing in Judeo-Arabic, and they don't start writing in French and British. They start writing in standard Arabic. And intellectually, they start being part of this new Iraqi society. And that is what the poem that I started with is all about. It's about this moment where Jews are not only part of this emergent nationalist Iraqi society, but they're helping to build it. And I think the way that this is expressed most clearly is through language, right? Because the Arabic language is seen as a non-religious unifier of the society. And if we look at the role of the community maintains this identity, but the community is on such stable footing by the late 1920s that they now manage all their communal schools themselves. They don't have as close an attachment to the centers of these transnational philanthropies like the Alliance or the Anglo-Jewish Association. And to put this in perspective as kind of Jews as part of this urban society in Baghdad, in the 1920s, 25% of the city of Baghdad is Jewish, right? So Baghdad, people in Baghdad, they know Jews. They see them as their co-religionists. And if we look at kind of the educated middle class, maybe they represent 45% of that educated middle class at this point. And that is a combination of the rights of being a citizen, which give you access into a civil society, but also this past 19th century with this extra impetus of support from these Western European Jewish philanthropic societies. And then the final kind of tableau of a society is Egypt. And Egypt, kind of similar to Iraq, a little bit younger, dates to the Hellenistic era, right? If you've ever heard of Philo of Alexandria, he's an Egyptian Jew. You have historic Jewish centers in Cairo and Alexandria, Cairo, Geniza, but similar story. Alliance School gets built in 1868. By 1919, the community has such a robust modern infrastructure that they're managing their own schools. The difference between Egypt and Iraq is kind of twofold. One, the Jewish community, well, we'll talk about Cairo and Baghdad. In Baghdad is very homogeneous. These are Jews who see themselves as being part of this historic community. They speak the same language. They have the same origins. Egypt is a little bit different. It's really a heterogeneous Jewish society. You have Jewish families that have been there for generations. You have Jews from other areas of the Arab world who have moved there because of economic options. So there's a famine in Syria, Jews go to Egypt. There is a possibility to work for the civil service. Jews from Morocco go to Egypt. And then you have also European Jews who leave because of economic opportunity and political instability. So it's not the same cohesive community, and they don't speak Arabic. You have some Jews who speak Arabic, but they also speak French or other languages. And ultimately what happens is that in 1929, when Egypt passes a citizenship law, the majority of Egyptian Jews do not apply to be citizens. Whereas in Iraq, all Jews become citizens, which is different from any other place in the Arab world. And to show you kind of, one sec, where the position of this community is, because I keep talking about them as being part of these, educated middle classes. In 1947, the literacy rate of Egyptian Jewry was 82.2%. In contrast to in 1976, for all of Egypt, the literacy rate was only 38.2%. So what does this say? By the 1930s, in 3 of the 4 countries I mentioned, Jews were part of a flourishing middle class. And in Morocco, although Jews were poorer, they were still experiencing a great deal of socioeconomic mobility in this period. And that, I would argue, is paired with this kind of this position of being a bridge that was able to work with the West and with colonizers, but also be part of the local society. So what happens after World War II? Well, kind of this assimilationist ideal is severely challenged. What do I mean by that? Like after this highlight the kind of this new golden age. We can talk about, Jews in Muslim Spain as a golden age, and then the 20s and 30s as this golden age. Well, they see what happens to European Jewry, and especially Western European Jewry in places like France and the Netherlands, because they know about these communities, they read about them in Jewish newspapers. And this assimilationist idea, not of leaving your religion, but being part of the society and being part of the nation, right? Iraqi nation, Egyptian nation, Ottomanism earlier, that's really challenged. And as part of decolonization, which is beginning throughout MENA, which stands for Middle East and North Africa, there's political instability. And so Jews don't know what's going to happen to them, especially now that they're being seen as more Western. You have Zionists in Mandate Palestine, and Jews are seen in their communities as being, connected to these communities in Palestine. And that certainly leads to greater instability. And as you have new generations of Muslims who have now had access to secular schools, because we're a couple of generations later, there are quotas in the civil service and higher education to kind of balance it out, right? So if you look at, what do they call it in English? Affirmative action, you have these forms of affirmative action. So there's instability and there's unease. And now getting back to kind of these numbers, right? So these are the kind of accepted population numbers of Jews in the Middle East and North Africa, in the Arabic speaking world at this period. Right? And you'll remember what I showed you at the beginning with the numbers today. So what happens? Where do they go? Well, the vast majority will go to Israel. And then after Israel, France, and then much smaller numbers will go to England and the United States and a few other places. And, when I ask my students, well, why do you think they left? Usually they'll say it's because of the creation of the state of Israel. But I think if we look at the numbers, we look at the years of migration, that tells a very different story, right? The state of Israel is created in 1948. And most of this migration, with the exception of the Iraqis, really takes off after or before, much before, like in the case of Yemen. So what are the factors of this migration? Well, it's actually very closely linked to decolonization and this unease about what's going to happen. Certainly Zionism plays an impact. Arab nationalism, especially in Arab nationalism, which will then begin to position itself more and more towards being an Islamic Arab nationalism, where it starts out as kind of a pluralist Arab nationalism. And I think if we take these three things together, tremendous political and economic instability. So before I pivot towards the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa in Israel today and going to Israel, there is one exception, right, about those who go to Israel, and that's Algeria. The Jews, although they lose their citizenship during World War II temporarily under Vichy, French citizenship, the Algerian Jews leave not because of the creation of the state of Israel or because of Zionism. They leave because of the Algerian War of Liberation. And so in 1961, there's a referendum and Algeria becomes independent. And between 1962 and 1963, the overwhelming majority of Jews leave Algeria. And as you can see, 130,000 more or less go to France and only 25,000 go to Israel. Part of that is the Algerian Nationality Code denies citizenship to non-Muslims. But when the Algerian Jews, who are Algerian for generations, go back to France, by this period, they see themselves as being so French that they call themselves pieds noirs. And I don't know if anyone listening is familiar with the term, but it's actually the term that Europeans who settle in Algeria call themselves, right? And so you have this mass uprooting of a historic Jewish community, but it's not to Israel, it's to France. The civil servants, if you were a postman in Alger, you might end up being a postman in Marseille. But you have this very complex collective memory today, especially of Algerian Jews who see themselves as being very French and very tied to the French Republic, but also having this strong connection to Algerian society. And the cleavage between Jews and Muslims in Algeria was very much due to colonialism and the position the Jews were put in as part of the colonial apparatus. Now, so before we pivot to the Israel side of things, just highlighting, so in the period of the 1920s and 30s, there really is this symbiosis between the national and the transnational. What do I mean by that? Jews are part of their local societies, but they're also part of these transnational Jewish organizations. And it doesn't really pose a problem. They're not mutually exclusive. And we see this flourishing of Jewish linguistic creativity in Arabic. You see Jews holding important posts in multiple governments. And it's really kind of like this heyday of Jewish life in the Arab world. But the end of the communities is complicated. It's not just a consequence of the state of Israel. It has to do with multiple factors: colonialism, of course, Arab nationalism, decolonization, but also this polarization with Israel, meaning that these communities flourish because they are merchants and they need borders to be open. And as the region becomes more closed, they don't know what their future will be in this. And politically, there is an erosion of security and societal position. And I think the idea of citizenship and the productions that citizenship plays are really important in this. And what's interesting, if we talk about the archives, is people seem to talk less about security reasons for leaving and more about economic reasons, in that they don't know what type of life their children will have in the future. They don't know what's going to happen with the governments. Now, I think there were also security reasons in part, but I think it needs to be contextualized a little bit as well. I see a question. Oh, which countries in South Asia? So the Iraqi Jews, sorry, getting back to this question, because I see I have to go quickly now because I went a little bit over. They go to India, and these Iraqi Jewish traders, they go to India, they set up communities in India, and then in Rangoon, Singapore, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. And if you want to know more about Jewish trade networks in Southeast Asia, I'm happy to answer more detailed questions about that in the question and comments. So, creation of the State of Israel. State of Israel assists Jewish communities in exiting, in leaving these communities. You maybe have heard of Operation Magic Carpet. And then the Iraq Operation Ezra and Nehemiah, which was the airlift of Iraqi Jews. What is life like for these Jews when they arrive in Israel? Remember, these are Jews who have a culture which is closest to the Muslim culture in the society they live, or this term I gave it being this Islamic culture. Well, Israel is a culture shock for them, right? The food is different. They come across people who speak Yiddish. The dress in some ways is different. Although they've become Western, they still see some differences in gender roles. Israeli society remains less religious and less traditional than the societies they're used to. And most importantly, I would say, they come in contact with different Ashkenazi Jews, because they are in contact with Ashkenazi Jews in their home countries as part of these transnational networks, and also some Eastern European Jews who settle in their places of origin. But these are Jews who see themselves as being linked historically, culturally, and who want to help their communities. The Ashkenazi Jews they come across in Israel see the Jews from the Arab world as being inferior for the most part. And they see this need to kind of de-Arabize them. And that is really a culture shock. And that they're put kind of socially in Israel, especially in the 50s and 60s, below the Ashkenazi majority. That is just as traumatic as leaving their home countries. So when they, When they arrive, they're put in transit camps called Ma'abarot. And these are some pictures. And lots of Ashkenazi Jews who live in Israel are also put in these transit camps. But we know that Jews from the Arab world stayed in them for significantly longer, and the quality of the housing they were given on average was not as good as that of the Jews who came from Europe. Similarly to that, when they were placed in housing, when they left these camps, Jews from the Arab world were often put at the periphery. So in the Negev desert, on the borders, which gave them fewer options for socioeconomic improvement. And to this day, we see the economic ramifications of that, in that it took several decades for many of these families who were impoverished because they had to leave their businesses, their homes in the Arab world when they left, to kind of get back into a middle class. And part of that has to do with decisions that the state of Israel made in terms of where they would resettle people. So those of you listening, maybe you've heard the term Mizrahi Jew, and you'll realize that I didn't mention it until now. And the reason is that prior to really the 50s and 60s, the term Mizrahi Jew didn't exist. It just means Eastern, because each of these communities had its own identity, right? Some people call themselves Sephardic because their tradition was from Spain, or Maghrebi because it was North African, or Baghdadi because they were from Baghdad, or Halabi because they were from Aleppo, but there was no one term. When they got to Israel, they were all kind of put in the same basket, and you had this new identity which came out of what is overall a negative experience. And so you have Jews from Morocco to Iraq who begin to say, well, if you're going to call us Mizrahi, I guess we'll call ourselves Mizrahi. But we'll do that, and we'll fight kind of our own liberation movement. And that really begins in the 1970s with the Black Panther movement in Israel. It's born out of a poor Moroccan area of Jerusalem called Musrara. They are inspired by the Black Panthers in the US and the civil rights movement, and it's to highlight social inequalities between Jews with origins from the Arab world and Jews with origins from Europe. It's not super successful, although as you can see by the image, they did get a commemorative postage stamp, but there's a large indirect political success. And this is what really brings Israeli society to start talking about the treatment of Jews from the Arab world upon their arrival in Israel. And I would say part of the outcome of that is the Shas party, if anyone follows Israeli politics. That's a national Sephardi Mizrahi religious party. And one interesting fact, so the image is of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who is now deceased, but he was the chief Sephardic rabbi in Israel for some time. And he was also the head of this political party. The dress of the chief Sephardic rabbi in Israel is the same dress of the chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire. So it just goes to show you kind of how the Ottoman tradition still has an influence today. And similarly to that, the Shas party, which stands for Shomrei Sepharad, so like the protectors of the Sephardic world, now they group everything, even those who historically didn't see themselves as being Sephardic, into this group, because Ovadia Yosef is born in Baghdad and then lives in Cairo before going to Israel. It garners a lot of support from non-ultra-Orthodox Mizrahi Jews. And that also goes back to kind of what happens in the 19th and the 20th century, in that you don't have this fraction of reform and conservative Judaism. So Jews who are less observant but still identify as Mizrahi are still able to identify with this type of political party. And you see that the Shas party has some more moderate views compared to the other ultra-Orthodox parties. They supported Oslo I, although they did an Oslo II. So it shows kind of the longer religious consequences of this, which are still very much in Israel today. So almost there. Today, remnants of Jewish life still exist in the Arab world. You have synagogues, which are synagogues and cemeteries and cultural institutions, which you can visit, particularly in Morocco, but also in Tunisia, which are easier places to visit, but you can also go to Egypt and visit the Ben Ezra synagogue. North African Jewish culture flourishes in France. And I think there's a growing interest. If you've ever, you celebrated Mimuna at the end of Passover, that's a classic Moroccan Jewish tradition. In Israel today, Arab Jewish culture has certainly permeated most aspects of Israeli society. The food, the music is now very much influenced by these traditions, although it wasn't necessarily in the 50s or 60s. You have a great deal of intermarriage in Israel. And what I mean by intermarriage is not Jews marrying non-Jews, but Jews marrying Jews whose families come from other places. So I think in Israel today, it's estimated that 20% of the population has a grandparent from Morocco, maybe a grandparent from North Africa. So this has kind of also diminished social tensions, although I would say there is still some discrimination, misunderstanding, and some socioeconomic disparities, which haven't completely disappeared. And well, if you're interested in that, I can give you some references to read about. So this kind of whirlwind talk, if you're interested in like learning more or exploring more, a couple of suggestions. If you want to see the institutions of Jewish communities in the Arab world, go to the website Diarna, which is associated with the American Sephardi Federation, and it's an interactive map where you can see different buildings, some which still exist, some which don't exist. It's free and completely open. The American Sephardi Federation and the Sephardic Heritage International of DC are both American foundations which preserve the heritage and culture of the Jews from the Muslim world. They do fantastic programming. Now a lot of it's on Zoom, so you can watch it from your home, but DC, Manhattan, not so far away from New Jersey. I definitely suggest you get on their websites and see what they're organizing. If you want to read more, this is a great book. It's not so expensive, called The Jews of Arab Lands, A History and Source Book. There's one that's medieval and one that's modern, and it will give you a very well-written kind of basic history, and then it's primary source documents translated into English. So you can kind of understand the documents we work with, but you don't have to learn any of the languages. And if you're affiliated with a university, then you probably have free access to the Encyclopedia of Jews in the Islamic World. And that can give you the basic histories of pretty much any country that relates to Jews in the Islamic world. And then finally, the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. Don't go to their website now, go to their website in 6 months, because it's an amazing free online resource, which can kind of, which covers 5,000 years of Jewish history, if you will, and it's free, but they've really been working hard to include information, imagery, documents from the Jews of the Islamic world. So that, I think, is also another great resource. Whew. Just a little bit over in time. So thank you, everybody who stayed on for this very long talk. And I'm happy to answer any and all questions you may have. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Are there other questions? I don't see any in the chat room, but you may have gotten some directly.
I'm just going to take my laser pointer off. Okay. The term is used to refer to Jews who have married to a different culture, e.g. Ashkenazi and Sephardi. Oh, okay. I think that, right, when I said intermarriage, I just meant Jews marrying who have different religious traditions, but it's actually been very important for kind of the evolution in Israeli society and the way that the religion and culture not the religion, but let's say the culture and traditions of Jews from the Islamic world are seen in Israel. And I think, if you've read the article in the New York Times about henna parties, for example, I can stop my share now. You can see that Jews are doing henna parties now, which definitely comes from the Muslim world. And that's something that's shared by Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and in Indian traditions as well, for example. And certainly the foods that are eaten at holidays are now becoming more universal in Israel.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. If there are no other questions, Jerry, have a concluding remark?
Yes. You can hear me, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Sasha, you have taken an extremely wide subject and condensed it like Hillel on 1 foot into an hour and a half, which had to be very challenging to do. On behalf of our audience and the Adult Education Committee, we thank you, Sasha, for your very interesting and informative presentation. I'd also like to thank Frank Lees of our committee, who served as Zoom master for this program. And I want to thank all of you who participated and listened in for being a wonderful audience. I'm just going to mention 2 upcoming programs very quickly. February 6th, the National Chavarah Committee will be doing a memorial program for Rabbi Robert Goldenberg of blessed memory, and that is at 7 p.m. on February 6th. On February 16th, at 7:30, a program called Dayenu, Confronting the Climate Crisis with Rabbi Jenny Rosen. Watch for upcoming emails, weekly announcements on the TJC website for complete details. Again, Sasha, that was wonderful. Really enjoyed it tremendously. And I thank you again on behalf of our community. And I'll say to everyone, have a good day.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, Sasha. If there are no other questions, I'll stop the recording.